Have you ever been in a meeting, watching a movie, or even listening to a song and suddenly, tears start rolling down your face? And then comes that familiar wave of embarrassment. Why am I like this? Why do I cry so easily? You try to hide it. You look away. You blink rapidly. You pretend something got in your eye. But here's what nobody tells you: the fact that you cry easily is not a weakness. It is actually one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally intelligent traits a human being can have. Today, we're going to go deep into the science, the psychology, and the hidden truth behind people who cry easily, and by the end of this video, you will never see your tears the same way again. First, let's understand what we're actually talking about. Crying easily, or what psychologists call emotional lability, means that a person has a lower threshold for emotional responses. Their nervous system reacts more quickly, more deeply, and more visibly to emotional stimuli. This could mean crying during movies or TV shows, tearing up when someone raises their voice, feeling overwhelmed by beautiful music, crying when they see someone else in pain, or breaking down during arguments even when they don't want to. Now, many people confuse this with being too sensitive or emotionally unstable. But research tells a very different story. A 2011 study published in the journal Cognition and Emotion found that people who cry more frequently tend to score higher on empathy scales, meaning they are more emotionally aware, not less emotionally controlled. Crying easily is not a malfunction of the emotional system. It is actually the system working at full capacity. Here's something fascinating that most people don't know. Humans are the only animals on Earth who cry for emotional reasons. Other animals produce tears to protect their eyes. But humans, we cry when we're sad, happy, frustrated, moved, or even when we witness something beautiful. Why? It comes down to the brain. When you experience a strong emotion, your limbic system, the emotional center of your brain, sends signals to the hypothalamus, which then activates the lacrimal glands, your tear glands. People who cry easily have a limbic system that is more reactive and more sensitive to emotional input. But here's the important part: this is not a disorder. It is a neurological variation. In fact, scientists have found that emotional tears contain higher levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, than regular tears. This means that when you cry, your body is literally releasing stress through your tears. Crying is not weakness. It is your body's built-in stress relief system. And people who cry easily, their body is just very efficient at using it. Now let's talk about who these people actually are, because people who cry easily tend to share some very specific personality traits. The first thing you'll notice is that they are highly empathetic. People who cry easily feel other people's emotions almost as strongly as their own. When they see someone suffering, their brain activates the same neural pathways as if they were suffering themselves. This is called mirror neuron activation, and in people who cry easily, this system is highly developed. This is why they cry at movies, at strangers' weddings, or even at a sad post on the internet. They don't just observe emotion, they absorb it. The second trait is that they are deep processors. People who cry easily don't experience the world on the surface. They think deeply, feel deeply, and process information at a much more profound level than average. Psychologist Elaine Aron calls this trait high sensitivity, and research shows that around 15 to 20% of the population has a highly sensitive nervous system. These people notice details others miss. They feel the weight of words, music, and moments more intensely. Third, and this might surprise you, people who cry easily often have high emotional intelligence. Contrary to what most people think, they are more emotionally intelligent, not less. They can identify their feelings quickly. They can name emotions precisely. And they are usually very aware of the emotional atmosphere around them. They are also deeply compassionate. People who cry easily almost always have a strong moral compass. They are deeply bothered by injustice, cruelty, and suffering. They feel a strong pull to help others, and when they can't, that helplessness often shows up as tears. And finally, the difficult side: they sometimes struggle with emotional regulation. Because they feel so much, they sometimes can't manage those feelings in real time. They may cry during arguments not because they're manipulating anyone, but because the emotional intensity overwhelms their ability to stay composed. Their brain floods with emotion before they can process it. Now the big question: why are some people like this and others aren't? The answer is a combination of genetics, upbringing, and life experiences. Research shows that sensitivity and emotional reactivity have a strong genetic component. If one or both of your parents were emotionally expressive or sensitive, there's a higher chance you inherited that trait. Studies on twins have shown that the tendency to cry has a heritability rate of about 40 to 50%, meaning nearly half of it is written in your DNA. But the environment you grew up in plays a massive role too. Children who grew up in households where emotions were openly expressed tend to be more emotionally expressive as adults. On the other hand, and this is where it gets complex, children who grew up in unpredictable, stressful, or emotionally chaotic environments can also develop a heightened emotional sensitivity as a survival response. Their nervous system learned to be on high alert, always scanning for emotional signals in the environment. Psychologist John Bowlby's attachment theory tells us that the bond we form with our caregivers in early childhood shapes our emotional responses for life. People with an anxious attachment style formed when caregivers were inconsistent tend to have more intense emotional responses, including crying more easily. They learned early on that emotions are powerful signals, and their nervous system never forgot that lesson. And then there is past trauma. People who have experienced emotional trauma often have a sensitized stress response system. Small triggers can activate large emotional reactions because the nervous system has been trained to respond strongly to protect the person from further harm. This is not weakness. This is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Here's something that people who cry easily know all too well: the world is not always kind about it. They get told, "Stop being so sensitive. You're too emotional. Toughen up. You cry over everything." And over time, many of them begin to believe it. They start seeing their own tears as a flaw, something to be ashamed of, something to fix. But let's look at this from a psychological perspective. The idea that crying is weakness is a cultural construct, not a psychological truth. In many ancient cultures, crying was seen as a sign of depth and wisdom. The Stoics, often associated with emotional control, actually believed that suppressing emotions was far more dangerous than expressing them. Modern research backs this up completely. A 2014 study by the American Psychological Association found that people who suppress their emotions regularly have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, anxiety disorders, depression, and weakened immune function. Meanwhile, people who express emotions, including through crying, show better long-term psychological health. The stigma around crying isn't based on science. It's based on outdated cultural ideas about strength, particularly around gender, where men are told from childhood that crying is unacceptable. But the truth is simple: crying is not weakness. Pretending you feel nothing, that is the real cost. Now let's talk about what's actually remarkable about people who cry easily, because the strengths that come with this trait are significant. They are exceptional listeners. Because they feel deeply, people who cry easily are often extraordinary at making others feel heard and understood. When someone shares pain with them, they don't just hear the words, they feel the weight of them. This makes them some of the most comforting people in any room. They form deep connections. People who cry easily don't do shallow relationships. They crave authenticity, depth, and genuine emotional connection. And because they are willing to be vulnerable themselves, they create the kind of relationships where others feel safe to be vulnerable too. They are also highly creative. Research consistently shows a link between emotional sensitivity and creativity. Artists, writers, musicians, and storytellers disproportionately share this trait. Their ability to feel deeply gives them access to emotional landscapes that others can barely touch. They are morally sensitive. People who cry easily are often deeply bothered by cruelty, unfairness, and suffering. This makes them powerful advocates, activists, caregivers, and leaders, people who build more humane systems because they are genuinely moved by human pain. And perhaps most surprisingly, they heal faster emotionally. Because they don't suppress or bottle up their emotions, people who cry easily tend to process difficult experiences faster. Grief, loss, disappointment, they feel it fully, which allows them to move through it rather than being trapped by it. Of course, life is not always easy when you feel everything so intensely. Let's talk honestly about the challenges, and what actually helps. One of the most common frustrations is crying in professional settings. Tears in a work meeting or during a performance review can feel mortifying, and can lead others to misread you as unstable. What helps is learning to recognize the early physical signs of tears, a tightening in the throat, burning behind the eyes, and using grounding techniques in that moment. Deep breathing, pressing your tongue to the roof of your mouth, or briefly looking up can all help delay the response long enough to regain composure. Another challenge is being misread as manipulative. Some people interpret frequent crying as emotional manipulation, as a tactic to gain sympathy or avoid accountability. What helps is being honest and direct about your emotional experience. Saying, "I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, but I want to continue this conversation," communicates that your tears are not a strategy, they are a genuine response. Then there is emotional exhaustion. When you absorb everyone's emotions and feel everything so deeply, burnout is a real risk. What helps is setting emotional boundaries. Learning to distinguish between your feelings and other people's feelings. And deliberately building recovery time into your life space to decompress after emotionally intense experiences. And finally, low self-esteem around the trait itself. Many people who cry easily have spent years being told something is wrong with them, and have internalized that message. What helps is education, exactly like this video. Understanding the psychology and neuroscience behind your emotional sensitivity can replace shame with self-awareness. You're not broken. You're built differently, and that difference has real value.